What I want to do today is we're really looking at the 3 C's, so creating a culture of consent, capacity, and comfort, and we're going to build on the discussion that we had last time. Today, I want to really get into some of the tools. We're really going to look at different ways that we can talk to folks. How do we bring this up? And I'm really excited to be part of this live discussion with everyone. So my hope is that we are all unmuted and that we can speak up as we're comfortable. That being said, though, if you are in an environment where there's other folks, maybe you have a dog barking, maybe you're working from home, just go ahead and mute yourself, and then you can unmute yourself as needed. So that'd be great. All right. So just in case any of you were not present for the discussion that we had a couple weeks back, I will introduce myself. So my name is Becky Van Tassel. I work at the Calgary Sexual Health Center, and I've been in the field of talking about sex and sexuality in public and getting paid for it. That's the important piece, for about 16 years. I am a social worker by background, but I have really delved into adult learning in the last about 6 years because I believe working with professionals is probably the most important thing that I can be doing. So I work for an organization that's located up here in Canada. We're having a very dreary day. I hear you're having nice weather down there. And I work for a place called Calgary Sexual Health Center. I would recommend that you look us up online. We are one of the larger sexual health organizations in Canada, and we offer a full spectrum of services. One of the projects that we've been working on for a couple of decades is actually supporting sexuality for individuals with developmental, intellectual, and physical disabilities. And so that is why I'm here today to work with you. I'm also here to learn with you and to chat with you and really to collaborate on this process around what you can do to continue providing really excellent sexual and reproductive health services for folks and adolescents with disabilities. So the goal for our live stream today is to feel an increased comfort in bringing up and addressing the topic of sexuality, consent, and healthy relationships with adolescents with disabilities. And I'm hoping by the end of this that all of us will report an increased ability to modify the PCADV adolescent relationship abuse cards so that we can really be using these in our interactions with adolescents with disabilities to talk about healthy relationships and consent. What's really interesting about those cards is they're actually quite popular. We know about them in Canada, and they're considered a resource that we use quite a bit, actually, through our Calgary Domestic Violence Coalition. So I think that they're really great, and today I want to brainstorm with you different ways that we can use them for all of the folks that we're going to be working with. All right. So for those of you who were with me last time, you'll remember me talking about learning rights, and I want to talk about this again because I believe it's a really important element to us sharing together. Some of us maybe are very comfortable having conversations online, and some of us are, maybe newer to these conversations. I just got a message from Shelby asking if we want to allow people to use their webcams, and I think, Shelby, if you want to open that up and give people the option, that's great. If individuals don't want to use their webcams, that's okay, but I would love it if we all did or try to, and that really does relate well to our rights. So for the discussion today, you do have the right to activate your webcam. I believe that Shelby is putting that out there as an option. You also have the right, though, to participate in whatever way you feel comfortable. We can use the chat function to really chat with each other and talk that way. I would love to hear your voices and connect. You also have the right, though, to pass by just kind of sitting back and taking this in and learning in that way. My feelings won't be hurt at all. I think these rights are really important when we talk about this topic because it can be difficult to talk about sexuality, even though for many of us this is what we do all day long and with various different people, it still can be challenging. The interesting thing about the topic of teaching about sexuality is that sexuality is personal to every one of us, full stop. We're all going to have different values, attitudes, beliefs when it comes to this topic, and we might feel uncomfortable. We also might not want to say something because we don't want to say the wrong thing or offend someone. So what I'm really encouraging you to do today is to think about these rights and how we want to participate, not just in this particular live chat, but in the future couple that are coming up. So like I said, you have the right to participate. Use your webcam if you want. Definitely feel free to leave yourself unmuted, jump in, chat. You also have the right to pass, so if you want to sit back and just kind of watch, that's okay. We all have the right to respect, and I think this one is really important because we do all have very different values when it comes to this topic. I don't want anybody to feel like they can't express their thoughts or their opinions. I think it's really important to get that out there. And I think there can be so many values about sexuality, particularly combined with disability, that it's really good if we're curious and we're open and we're thinking about, what some of those values may be in a respectful way. Hi, Fern. That's exciting. I can see you. I also want to talk about privacy. So I know that there's a lot of different folks on the line right now, and the first thing I'll say about privacy is if we can just be really careful not to talk about any of the adolescents that we work with in a specific way, just so that anybody from any of the other centers might not recognize, that person or that family. So protect our clients' rights to confidentiality. But I also want to protect kind of our rights to privacy as employees, which is interesting. So there's many different layers of staff that are on the line today. We might have some coordinators, we might have some administrators, and I think that's really great. There's a lot that we can learn from each other. I think one of the most important things about learning in a workspace is that we feel okay to make mistakes. It's okay to ask questions, even if your supervisor is perhaps sitting on the call with you. It's okay to have questions about policy or things that we're doing. And this is really, I think, a good place for us to talk about those things openly and honestly. And the last one is fun. I hope that we can really enjoy our time together and that we can learn some stuff from each other. So does everybody agree to this? If you agree, please use the little, if you go up to the top, you can see the little hands up, kind of thumbs up function. So if you agree to the rights, put up your hands. Wonderful. Great. I'm seeing a lot of your little hands shooting up in the air. You know what else is amazing is I'm recognizing a lot of your names from last time, so that's really cool. I'm excited to be getting to know all of you. Okay. So we're going to start by using the chat function a little bit. And so I want us to think about our interactions with the adolescents that we work with. And I want you to think about, particularly for the folks with disabilities, what are the reasons that people ask questions about sexuality? And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to type that. Yeah. So Caitlin says, for youth, I think they're trying to get to know themselves and their bodies. So I think that's an amazing answer. A lot of times when people ask us questions about sexuality, they're actually trying to figure out what's normal, right? Nobody wants to be the only person who had questions about their body. And I can tell you that they never are. A lot of the questions, and I'm sure you get these, are really similar. I also think people are curious, and this is a really great time for folks to start learning about their bodies. And as healthcare providers, professionals, they're going to reach out to us. What are some other reasons that people ask questions? You can feel free to just say it as well. They may think that they should be having sex, but they're unsure about so much, including if they think they should. Absolutely. I think the most common questions I've gotten as a sexuality educator is, should I have sex? When should I have sex? What age should I be when I have sex? A lot of folks have asked me when I first had sex, which is always super awkward, and of course I can artfully deal with that at this stage of my career. But really what they're wanting to know is about decision making. Pretty specific reasons why people ask questions. So they want to find out what's normal. A lot of the time they're checking to see if you're a safe person. So what is this person's values? Can I ask them questions? Are they going to respond positively to my questions? They might want to know about their values, right? A lot of folks are getting different information about their values from their parents, maybe from their church, maybe from the media, maybe from their friends, and all of that can be, I think, really confusing. Sometimes they want to shock you. But my response to this idea of shocking is to always act as if what they're asking is a good question. We never really know why people are asking questions, and so we should try to respond in a really positive and affirming way, really no matter what the question is. And then they're oftentimes trying to find out the accurate information. So if folks could just type this in, where do you think youth are often learning, or adolescents are learning about sex and sexuality? So Fern talked about pornography playing a significant role. If other people on the line agree that adolescents are learning about sexuality from pornography, how about you use the little raised hand icon? Got one person who's agreeing. How about a thumbs down if you disagree? Perhaps you're all neutral. What I can say is that I do think that pornography certainly does shape some people's information. So when I studied learning, a lot of what I focused on was the way in which we can learn through media. And a lot of folks do learn constantly through media. And for youth who aren't given information about their bodies, about sexuality, to figure out, what their values are, if folks aren't talking to them, then pornography is oftentimes, I think, a place where people are gaining information. And that information can be both positive and both negative. So I want to do a little activity with you. I want you to type in what you think people are learning from pornography. So what are some of the things they might be learning? Sex acts, absolutely. Unrealistic expectations, most certainly. Other people are typing. I think one of the things that we're noticing a lot up here is folks are learning about, bodies and maybe measuring themselves against something that they can't compare to. I like what Cecilia has said, roles during sex and what's supposed to be normal, and I think that that's a really important piece. Pornography in the absence of other education can really give a very skewed perception of what is consent. How do people ask about consent? How does that happen? Because it's pretty unnatural and unnormal, I think, not normal during pornography to have people actually engaging in a conversation about consent. Usually there's very little conversations about that at all. And so adolescents aren't necessarily getting to see what a sexual situation where consent is present and communication is present actually occurs. So now for individuals with developmental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, a lot of times those folks are not given the same opportunities for information as other folks. And certain disabilities, people can be quite concrete or literal in their thinking. And so if we think about folks who are not getting a lot of information, and the majority of their information is coming from something like the media or from pornography, how do you think that impacts those particular individuals? Is it different? What do you think? Quite a few people. Oh, good. Can you repeat the question? Absolutely. So for some people with particularly developmental disabilities, they may be very concrete in their thinking. And so if they're learning about sexuality from pornography, how does that translate? What does that look like? Here we go. So Caitlin has a really good point. People with disabilities are often not represented in mainstream media, so they might not see themselves as sexual beings or represented in pornography. So there may be no mention, which does erase an entire sexual identity, and I think that's really important. Or if a person is very concrete, they may take that quite literally, right? And if no one has taught them to have critical thinking in the area of media literacy, then that's a really big problem, which is why I think it's important when we talk to guardians and parents and stakeholders that we are really advocating for enhanced sexual health information for adolescents with disabilities because they may not have had that previous experience or information to help mitigate that. Megan talks about how it may be assumed that they cannot consent to sex, so they are not represented because it is seen as a taboo. I think that is also absolutely true. In our last session, we talked quite a bit about the social construction of disability and how people maybe have the false perception that people with disabilities are not actually able to consent. And so that really does create kind of a major issue when it comes to these conversations and these questions. So it can be awkward to talk about pornography with youth and adolescents who don't have disabilities. But one of the things that we believe is to really bring it up, to just have the conversation and to just put it out there. Because youth are curious and they're asking. So there's a few more people typing, so I'll just give them a minute to add their thoughts. Yeah. So sex is sometimes taught as a negative thing for those with disabilities. Oftentimes the message for youth and adolescents with disabilities is that if someone is interested in them sexually, they should just say no, right? And there's no information provided about positive things and how to negotiate and how to engage in a conversation about consent. And Fern said, how might this also look when adolescents with disabilities are learning from / sharing stories from peers? I think that's a really good question. What kind of information do you think folks are learning from their peers? You can all just type this in. Or say it out loud.
Can you hear me, Becky?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good. I was kind of thinking that maybe the same kinds of things they're looking for if they're, kind of looking to pornography, what does sex look like? What do you do during sex? What, expectations, those kinds of things. I think maybe they're just, still listening for the same baseline things, maybe?
And I think you're right. So there's been quite a bit of research in this area, and yeah. So youth with developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities are actually curious about the exact same things that neurotypical youth are interested in. And they are asking those same questions from their friends. And if parents and school systems are not stepping in, then that is the information that they're getting. The problem is that some of the research points out that folks with disabilities might be isolated. So they may not even be receiving this information in the same way. But also, again, if folks are quite literal or in their thinking, then this information can sometimes be presented in a really challenging way. And so that's why I think it's really important that we start having these conversations with all youth, as you are currently doing in your practices, but really enhancing and honing in on the importance of talking to youth with disabilities because they may not be accessing information in the same way. And so any question we receive from someone, it's really important that we take that quite seriously and answer in a really safe and affirming way. So this has already come up, but when do we typically talk about sexuality? So when do we talk to folks with disabilities about sexuality? And I'll give you a couple minutes a couple seconds, I guess, just to write in your experience, when do we have these conversations? All of you are typing. Thank you. So perhaps people are not having that conversation at all. I think that is very true. Oh, that's great. So maybe when an issue comes up. So I just want to really highlight this as a huge important piece. We oftentimes get called into situations at schools and in the community to go out and have a conversation with someone because maybe they've crossed someone's boundaries. We often get contacted because of public masturbation, maybe because somebody is flirting inappropriately, maybe touching people when they shouldn't be. And the thing that I find really interesting about that is we're sending a super strong message. If we're only providing people with information and responding to a crisis or a negative issue, we're really putting out there that the only time we talk about this stuff is that if something bad happens. And so the message for adolescents is that sex is something that's bad. It's something that could be punished. And so what we know is that that might cause people to stop talking, to not ask those questions, to not be really forthcoming with what's going on, which we know places people at risk, right? The best way to support people from experiencing sexual assault is actually by providing information. The other thing that we see too is sometimes folks with disabilities get labeled as perpetuators of violence or are seen as, folks who are maybe going to cross someone's boundaries. And really that's usually because there hasn't been good information put in place for that person to understand. And so I think it's really, really important that we're not talking about sexuality after the fact. Because if we're not talking about it at all and then only talking about it when there's an issue, the message is that sexuality is something that's taboo. It should be secret and kept private. And what we can do in that is really stigmatize people. So we want to be having these conversations really early on and really quickly. So the impact of not talking about this is shame, right? If you think about it, we start this from a young age where we don't teach children about the proper terms for their body parts. In fact, we maybe don't even talk about the genitals at all. And I think that can carry on into people's lives, so they don't feel as if they're able to really step out of that box and to say things. The other thing, too, is that we do often, and I think this has come up already, is we teach people that it's just about saying no. So I'm curious about the folks on the line and your experience with adolescents. What happens if the message is only just say no, if that's all we're teaching people? A whole bunch of you are typing, so thanks for being comfortable with sitting in the silence with me. Okay, this is really important. So Megan says, places responsibility on the victim and increases victim blaming. Absolutely, that's true. We're teaching people some very flawed information about consent. Consent is not the absence of a no. And I think if we only focus on giving people that one particular tool, we are really putting them in a place where we hear things like, well, why didn't you just say no? Right? I think it's like a very flawed way to teach consent. Caitlin has a good point. Then people are not learning healthy sexual behavior. So they're not learning about sexuality as a holistic manner, and that sometimes people will feel really comfortable in their head and their heart and their body to consent to sexual activity, and that it's actually okay to do this. So there's another comment that I think is really interesting, and they said, I'm still thinking about getting info from the media. If I were developmentally disabled, I would find some things about sexual portrayals to be frightening. If a person can't differentiate facial expressions, for instance, sex face, I like that there's quotes on that, can look violent, and I think that's really true. The other technique that we use with a lot of folks is around helping people who do have a hard time with facial recognition, really practicing and understanding what verbal or what physical consent can look like. So we actually will use pictures of people's different facial expressions, and we'll practice what does this person look like? Do they look happy? Do they look comfortable, right? That's a really important piece, I think, to bring out. And absolutely, I think you're right. If somebody, is seeing things really concretely, sex can look really violent, and it can look really scary and not pleasurable. And so it is really important, I think, for all humans, the impact that media can have on how we understand sex and sexuality and consent. All right, so in terms of how we talk about sexuality and how we bring it up, specifically with folks with developmental disabilities, um, I'm curious about folks in the room. Here are some of my ideas. But what are some of the things that you do in order to create a safe and comfortable environment to talk to folks with disabilities? And you can grab the mic or you can type it in, whatever you're more comfortable with. So I'll just go through my list. So some of the things that we really suggest to people is that you're very proactive. I think if you're a health educator within a school, it can be really great if you can pair up with the special education teachers to get in there and really start providing some inclusive education to the students. I also think it's important that you put out the word that you're comfortable and you're willing to talk about this. And so this could include creating posters and information that's written in very concrete, plain language, that's given out to a lot of the teachers and the disability serving community organizations in your area to let them know that this is something that you can do. I think it's really important as professionals that we take the time to listen. I know that sometimes we're really busy and we have a lot of things going on, but we can learn a lot about a person's questions if we just try to be present and take the space and the time to be there. Creating a safe and comfortable environment is probably the most important thing, and I know that you already do this with all of the adolescents that you see, but starting with what you tell me is confidential, right, within your limits of confidentiality. Trying to find a private space to be having these conversations. Sitting down and using lots of different tools that you can incorporate. So for example, for folks with disabilities, we want to use a lot of different ways of teaching. So we might incorporate some visual tools. We might bring in some things for them to read privately on their own. We might suggest some videos. We really are going to, modify our approach based on that individual's learning strengths. It's really important that we're, aware that when someone asks us a question, that we're actually providing full answers to every question. It can be, I think, easy to skip over or gloss over questions and maybe even to assume what students know. I remember when I first started doing this work, it was quite some time ago, but I was teaching a grade 11 class, and there were so many questions about how babies were made. And I was quite surprised because they were 17, 18 years old, and I had really just put my assumption in what they needed to know and what they already knew, because verbally they were really strong. It sounded as if they really were very comfortable and knew a lot. But when it got down to the questions, I realized that I was making a lot of my own assumptions. So Fern says, make your part of the conversation and supportive materials relevant to the person you're talking to. I think that's probably the most important piece. Really understand who they are, and even though it can be hard because you're seeing sometimes a high volume of people, recognizing, even asking them, how do you best learn? How do you want to know this information? I also say don't worry about being, with it or knowing all of the terminology. It's okay if you don't, and you can ask for clarification. In fact, I'd really encourage clarification a lot of the time. It's okay if you get embarrassed, and it's okay if you're surprised by a question. It's just really important that, you let them know that that question is normal. And definitely don't worry about having all the answers. You might not, and that's okay. What is important is that you help that person find the answers that they might need. All right, so this activity I'm hoping you can all participate in, but I want you to list 3 of the most common words that you use in your interaction with adolescents. So if everybody could just write down 3, that'd be super great. And I'm going to get some water, so you have a minute to do that. Oh, these are good. Okay, keep writing down your questions. Right. So I'm going to read out the questions, or read out the statements that you made, and I think they're really quite good. So we have responsibility, choices and consequences, interesting, teen-friendly, confidential, safe space, or safe place. I use that a lot as well. I said consent, healthy, and rights. And Megan said healthy, sex-positive, holistic. Okay, interesting. Fern is going to type a couple too. Respect, no, and healthy. Excellent. Okay. So I want us to think a little bit about plain language. So plain language is basically language that is plain, language that is understandable, language that can be comprehended kind of across, regardless if someone's an English language learner or maybe, doesn't, it's really making what you're saying as simple as possible, okay? And plain language use is a really important technique when we think about talking about sexuality for folks with disabilities. So I want us to think about some of these languages, and I'm going to pick on one of my own. So consent. Is that an easily understood topic or concept? You can, if you think it's easily understood, you can give me a little thumbs up in the participant box there. Oh, I see some crosses. Those are good. Yep. Lots of kind of X's happening. Consent is not a plain language word, and I use it all the time. So one of the ways that I frame consent that is more plain language is I'll say choice. Means you can say yes or you can say no. And everybody is allowed to say yes or to say no. What about rights? That's another word that I use all the time. Give me a check mark or an X if you think that's an easily comprehensible word.
What did you say, rights, Becky?
Yeah, I said rights. Thanks, Fern.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Caitlin thinks it is, and that's cool. I think it can be if you're careful about how you talk about it. A lot of other people are saying no. So for those of you who said rights is an easily understood word, can you type out or verbally tell me how you would explain rights?
That's a good question.
If you are. I phrase it as human rights. Yep, so do we. It's great. How do we make that really obvious to everybody what we mean? Ah, thanks, Cecilia. Right comes across as correct to those who may not understand it. So I think that that's a really important point, Cecilia. English is wonderful for having several meanings for the same word. And so rights is something that I actually feel like it's really important that we talk to people about and are very clear about what that means, because it's not about being correct, but I've definitely heard people interpret it that way. Choice or opportunity? Great answer. So I like to talk a lot about choices. That's a much more plain language word to talk about something that I hold is fundamentally important, which is human rights. And I think for folks with disabilities, it's even more important that we are honoring choice and we're honoring that idea of having rights, because so often we see people not really being encouraged to make choices or to exercise their rights as sexual beings. Caitlin says, or I explain it as a person, it is your right to blank, or it is within your rights to. And I think that's really great. What I love about what you're saying, Caitlin, is you're really taking the time to unpack that idea and really spell it out. So I think that's excellent. There's a lot of different things in here that people said. And I think healthy is another interested one, because a couple people said healthy. So do we think healthy is a plain language concept? Let's get a little show of check marks or X's. And it's okay, we can totally disagree on this one. But one answer. So a couple of people are saying that it's maybe not a super clear thing, and a couple of people are saying yes, it is. I think healthy is really interesting because I think healthy itself could be quite value-laden. We as professionals might have different ideas about what is considered a healthy relationship or a healthy situation that other people may not. And so I think when we talk about healthy, it's really important that we talk about that a bit more. What I really love about your resource cards that you made is that you really talk about behaviors that a person would want to be concerned about or check in about, because healthy by itself is like a pretty broad concept and highly subjective, whereas if you use the cards and really go through kind of what the behaviors are that could be considered not healthy, That's a beautiful way of being very concrete in your statement to really unpack that. What I would encourage folks to do is to spend some time and really think about the language that we use with youth commonly. Is it plain language? Is it understandable? Does it have multiple meanings? Is there a way that we can say this simpler? And one of the things that we do as an organization is actually practice and look at our curriculum to vet it for plain language markers. The great thing about plain language is that not only does it make it more comprehensible for students with disabilities, but it's more inclusive for English language learners. It's more inclusive really for a lot of people, people from various different literacy levels. And I think the more plain we can be in the way that we talk about things, the better our interactions are with people. So your homework is to think about some of the most commonly used phrases that you use in your day-to-day practice. Maybe look at your curriculum that you commonly use or your tools that you give to adolescents. And I want you to really think about some of the language that's used there. I can also send out some information about plain language for you folks as well. All right, so Fern talked about this when she said that it's really important to always work with strengths. We always want to work with the individual from a place that makes sense for them. If we are working with a particular adolescent and we develop a rapport, we're getting to know them, one of the questions I like to ask, and I mentioned this earlier, is how do you best like to learn? And, people usually know. And so when they say, well, I like to look at things, great. Then you make sure that you're catering around that particular learning strengths and styles. Again, the great thing about the tool that we're looking at today and that you have in your state is that you can use that tool in a few different ways. You can talk through it so you can meet the needs of auditory learners. You can actually use it and kind of point and move through it and read, and so you're also touching on visual learning as well. And in many ways, you can take it forward to actually role play. You could role play some of the scenarios in there. You could really talk to youth about their experiences and move into that tactile learning piece. So learning through experience is very possible with those. So these are the cards I keep talking about. And I'm curious, who uses these cards regularly in your practice? And if you do, just give me a little check mark. Sarah, Megan, Cecilia, I'm going to assume most of you are using these really regularly. Does anybody want to just grab the mic or maybe type and talk about how you like to introduce these cards in a situation with a youth? So Megan says, our coordinators have said they like to bring them up with teens when teens are discussing relationship issues or norms. For example, their partner likes to read their text messages. So I think that's really awesome. A scenario that I would bring forth is, say you're working with a youth who has a disability. It's their first relationship, and they're asking you those, am I normal questions, right? And so is it normal that, my partner wants to spend all their time with me and they're uncomfortable with me going out with family and friends? The easy answer would be, no, that's not normal. But obviously that's not how we work with people, right? That would be not good practice. So what you could do is take the healthy relationship card and say, that's a really great question. I'm glad you asked me that. How about we walk through this and we talk about some of the things, that this resource says. And so we're going to do that a little bit in the next slide. Does anybody else want to share how they like to use these cards? Because I think what Megan's brought up is a really excellent example. Anybody else? Okay. So in looking at these and the way in which we've actually used these resources here is we oftentimes do exactly that. We'll use them in a counseling session. They also can be really great to just kind of leave in places so that people are able to look at them and let you know that you are a resource that can talk through this. In your clinics, you may want to leave them in a place where youth can grab them and really have that conversation. I think it's also really helpful to just use it as a teaching tool. So we're talking today about relationships, and I think this is a really good way of doing that, and we're going to talk through this together. Okay, so this is directly context from the cards. I was trying to take a picture of them and put the picture in here, and it was truthfully really challenging. So what I ended up doing is just copying the card and kind of taking this and putting it in here. So I want to think about a common question that I personally get is, and I brought it up, but when is it okay to have sex? So if a person were to say to me, when is it okay to have sex, I would say that's a great question. I'm really glad that you asked me that. So what is it that you mean by sex? That would be kind of my first query. And they might say, like doing it, whatever that might be. And so I would say, well, it sounds like you're, interested in being sexual with another person. Do you think that maybe we could take a look at this resource together? And so what I would probably do is sit down and say, so you don't have to share how you personally feel, but these are some things that maybe you want to think about. So if you're hanging out or hooking up with someone, you should probably feel safe. They should probably feel like it's a good choice for you. Do you feel safe with your person? Let them answer. You may want to say, does this person treat you with respect? And respect's a really not plain language word. So I might even say, like, how does this person treat you? Do you feel comfortable? Do they listen to you? Do you get to share your thoughts? Then I might talk about, some of the different elements that are in here. If you were to say yes to this decision and then you were to change your mind, what would that look like? Have you thought about how far you're willing to go? And so what I think is really good about this card is that every youth and every teenager is going to have a different sort of thing that they're worried about. And what you can do is kind of pull it through. So checking in, is there respect? Do you feel safe? These are some of the warning kind of areas, which I think is really good at the bottom. So I'm just curious if anybody has any other scenarios where they've maybe used the cards and it's worked really well for you that they're comfortable sharing. Fern, if you want to jump in here, you're totally welcome to as well. So the other thing about these cards, it's not a one-off. So when we work with folks with particularly intellectual or developmental disabilities, we never teach that information just one time. And so it's really important that you keep using these cards. And what's great is that if you're seeing a particular adolescent and you're seeing them more than once, really taking the time to every time bring up the same card. There's a really important piece around repetition in the messaging. The more you use the same tool, the more you talk about it, the more real those messages become and the easier it gets to use the tool. I know that last time we had chatted, people had said it's difficult when you're really busy and you have people kind of in and out. What I would recommend is definitely setting aside the time to sit down with someone, bringing this out, and really asking them lots of questions. One of the things that I like to do is explaining kind of what I'm reading from the card and then asking them, like, how do you interpret this? How does this feel in your life? For some folks who are maybe not super high in terms of verbal abilities, or they're quieter, part of their disability is that they don't process quickly or externally, it's okay for them to actually be pretty quiet around this, and then you may want to incorporate some other tools. So I talked about head, heart, body as a decision-making tool in the last session, and I think that paired with this particular handout could be a really excellent kind of way of taking up and using these in your practice. So I'm curious, do folks here have any questions or suggestions about the cards? Things that you would really like to point out about them or things that have worked well? And maybe, Shelby, I'm not sure if we're muted or not, but maybe we could unmute everybody and just kind of give people a chance.
I think you've covered some important pieces on how to sort of look at the card until we can really get it revised, how to look at the card and have that plain language conversation. So I hope that addressed a lot of people's concerns about, how you can kind of make that transition into plain language, real language delivery, especially with adolescents who are living with a disability. Some other questions have come up, but I don't, I know we were kind of saving them for the other live stream topics, so I would love to hear from, the coordinators that are on the line today. Becky, is it good practice to maybe deliver all of the cards at this level since you don't always know who is, at least to start with, since you don't always know who has these particular needs, communication needs?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And so, to be honest with you, the best practice is to be as inclusive as possible at all times with everybody. And so that does really mean using plain language always. We don't know. Much of disability is invisible. And like I had said, some folks are super good, and it's a kind of a silly term. I don't even know if I really like it, but it's called parroting. So you might be working with an adolescent who's super strong at repeating it, what you said, or they kind of know what they're supposed to say. And so there's a lot of people who are very verbal and able to do that, but if you actually were to start asking questions, they may not have the level of understanding that you think they have. And so I think that's why it's really important that with all youth, this is quite an interactive process with plain language. You're asking a lot of questions. You're using a lot of the visuals and the cues because, quite frankly, we often don't know. And it's hard sometimes to understand what people are grasping. I think Megan has a great point. Coordinators can use help to modify the message delivery of the card for lower literacy level. So I think that that's a really a good point, and it really might be about going, through it line for line with a person, and just like we did where we thought about our language with rights and consent, unpacking that, like, oftentimes plain language means using more words to describe a concept that we assume is quite simple but might not be for everybody. So part of it is time and really getting to know the cards well. I think the better the coordinators know the cards, the easier it is to really speak through them and talk to the content without necessarily reading right off the card.
Who would you suggest that they do a practice run with so that they can get comfortable with changing that to more plain language? And I know that you said that you would send out a resource too to kind of help with that, but do you suggest that they find maybe an adolescent in their life who's not maybe coming into their program, but maybe like a sibling or a cousin or just a colleague, or who might be the best type of person?
I mean, I think a colleague, honestly, would probably be the best type of person because it's safe to do that kind of work. But I would actually sit down with a colleague and really go through it and say, well, is this as clear as I think it is? Am I being as clear as I think I am? And to kind of role play, you may even want to, within each of your clinics, like work together as a team to ensure that you're using some of the same messaging, right? Read through the cards, talk about how you could modify things. The other thing, too, is like everybody understands things differently. And so the way that one person might explain one thing one time might work better. So it's just good to hear a lot of different perspectives on how people would rework the language.
And how, can you give us an example really quickly of how that parroting technique works? So what does that exactly look like? I heard your explanation, but if you can kind of...
Yeah, no. So times I have quite a bit of experience working with folks with a diagnosis of FASD, and for some individuals, they'll be really great if I said, a healthy relationship is where everybody feels respected. And they'll say, yeah, I know, a healthy relationship is where I feel respected. And then I would say, well, what does respect mean? And maybe they wouldn't actually know. So they could repeat back to you the content, and it sounds great, but when you start to dig a little bit deeper into that, they may actually not fully have processed things the way that we think. And a lot of folks are really good at this because it helps you get through life, right? It's a great skill to be able to communicate in that way.
So then would you kind of begin to unpack respect and say, walk with them through identifying that means being considerate of my feelings or my wants, or, walking through it that way, or would that still be too much?
I think I would say, somebody, if I were in a relationship with somebody and they respected me, that means that if I said no, they would say okay. If I said yes, they would be happy.
So you're getting even more specific in there.
Yeah. Respect means that if I want to watch a movie, they let me watch the movie and don't try to talk to me the whole time. You know, like get really basic. Clearly that's from my own personal life. But it's like very, very, very basic, really concrete examples.
Gotcha.
So Cecilia says, we deliver the cards through our condom packs, which I think is awesome. This way, every youth, every time, gets the information. The card is explained each visit to clarify the message as it relates to the youth's relationship.
I really, Cecilia, when I attended the site visit at Hamilton Health Center, I really appreciated when you explained to me how you put the cards in the packs and that you explained to it at every visit. I thought it was a really nice way to integrate it into everything that you're doing so that it wasn't such a separate piece, but it was really automatically built in up front with everyone.
I agree. I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
And if there's a possibility for that to happen in other sites, I would really strongly encourage that as a best practice. Any other questions or comments? I see Cecilia is just typing something. Yeah, thank you. Makes it a lot easier to use and the youth are more comfortable. I think that makes a lot of sense to me, Cecilia.
You're welcome.
So I have a couple of resources up here. Again, they are the same ones. In the future, we will be releasing a bunch of different guides around resources. And so our next couple of topics I think are going to be really fun. We're getting into inclusive sex education practices. We're going to talk about answering those difficult questions. We're going to talk about how to work with parents. We're going to talk about how to navigate other complex systems that adolescents are involved in. And so I promise you the next couple will be fun and interactive, and I'm really excited to get to know you all more. It's been really lovely working with you, and I think it's a really interesting and neat partnership that you all have going on with each other. Feel free to email me or Fern if you have any other questions and you want to maybe dig into this a little bit deeper. And please do feel free to give us any feedback about today and how this felt for you.